they can sit on the floor. We didn't expect that there'd be such an audience. So otherwise we could have taken a bigger hall. There are not many senior people, gray-haired like me, or less gray-haired like me, or no hair like me. That's true. So please. And Professor Guha is on his way, but he's there already. 7. Oh, but no, you're in time. How about a cup of tea or something? Huh? Please. Friends, very good evening and welcome. On behalf of the Raza Foundation and the India Habitat Center. The Raza Foundation, in collaboration with the India Habitat Center, have been organizing as many as 8 annual memorial lectures. They aimed at creating a body of critical mass thinking ideas about music, dance, theatre, cinema, architecture, ideas themselves, cinema. And these lectures are named after some of the most outstanding personalities of our cultural life. Kumar Gandhar, Habib Tanveer, P.S. Gaitonde, Agge, Daya Krishna, Kilchand Mahapatra, Mani Kaul, Charles Correa. The Daya Krishna Memorial Lecture, this is the 4th one. We have had 3 speakers before, Pratap Bhanu Mehta, Ananya Vajpayee, and Shiva Vishwanathan. And today we have Professor Ramachandra Guha. Now, Daya Krishna was a philosopher, basically, but he covered a very large area of human imagination and intelligence, knowledge, negation, thinking about thinking, Indian philosophical traditions, Shruti, Veda, transgressions, free thinking, etc. And here was a philosopher who was deeply interested in and involved with the creative arts and literature of his time. He once wrote about the realm of the arts. It's a world which is more profound, more meaningful, and more significant, where freedom obtains in a deeper sense that we are ever able to find in the so-called normal world we live in. And he goes on, the arts then are ultimately rooted in what may be called the art of living. And unless life is seen in terms of an artistic creation, we cannot understand the creation which is embodied in a work of art. So we organized this lecture, and of course, this is the largest attended lecture ever organized by us. And thank you very much for coming. I'm going to thank Ramachandra Guha to be such an attraction. Ramachandra Guha, as you know, is a man of history. I mean, he's a historian. But he is an historian who combines the rigor of history with contemporary concerns and anxiety. And that is what makes him special. He has been a historian and writer whose interests have a very wide range, from environment to Mahatma Gandhi to democratic India to cricket. This indeed is a wide range, and he has been a regular contributor. Some of us have been reading him in the columns that he writes for the Telegraph and the Hindustan Times. Yes, and he has also been a visiting position in the London School of Economics and Political Science, Philippe Roman Chair in History and International Affairs. And he is one of those in our time, and we have very few of them now, unfortunately, who can be legitimately called public intellectuals, intellectuals which engage with public issues. So here is Ramachandra Guha, who is going to talk to us about 8 threats. I hope there are 8, it can be more or less. Surely not less. It has to be more. Threats to freedom of expression. Professor Ramachandra Guha.
Yeah. Mr. Vajpayee said that of the 4 lectures so far, this is the best attended. And there's a simple explanation. I'm the first Daya Krishna lecturer who's not from Delhi. Daya Krishna himself was not from Delhi, he was from Jaipur, so perhaps there's a lesson there. Invite more people from outside Delhi, and you'll get even bigger audiences. Thank you also for the kind introduction. Though I have deeply ambivalent feelings about the term public intellectual. Because as someone said, the more public an intellectual becomes, the less of an intellectual he remains. So, with that caveat, let me begin. 8 threats to freedom of expression in India. And since it's a lecture in memory of a philosopher, I'm going to quote a philosopher to begin with, who will be unnamed for the moment, so I'll identify him a bit. This writer said, and I quote, "No one can transfer to another person his natural right or ability to think freely and make his own judgments about any matter whatsoever. No one can transfer to another person his natural right to think freely and cannot be compelled to do so. That is why a government which seeks to control minds is considered oppressive." This is what a great philosopher once said. And he went on to observe, "A government which denies each person freedom to speak and to communicate what they think will be a very violent government. Whereas a government where everyone is conceded this freedom to speak and to communicate what they think will be a moderate government." Who was this wise writer? It was the philosopher Baruch Spinoza, writing in 1670. Now, by this token, how democratic is India? In my book, India After Gandhi, published 10 years ago, I described India as a 50-50 democracy. This is a line I stole from the great Hindi comic actor Johnny Walker, who in a film in which he was a sidekick of some boss, to any answer, any question that the boss posed, will I marry this girl, will my business be successful, he would answer, boss, 50-50. And I appropriated this line in memory of a great Hindi actor called Johnny Walker, originally Badruddin Umar from Indore, if I'm not mistaken. And I argued that our democracy is a 50-50 democracy. There are some areas in which we are truly democratic. Free and fair elections is one. I think the Election Commission is one of our model institutions. On the day that elections are held, all of India is one, and everybody votes, regardless of caste or class or gender. Contrary to democratic theory, in India, unlike Western Europe or North America, poor people vote in larger numbers. So that's one area in which we are recognizably democratic. Another area is free movement of peoples. I've come from Delhi, no one can stop me. You can come to Bangalore if you wish, no one can stop you. This is not the case in China, for example, and in some other authoritarian regimes. But there are other areas in which there are serious democratic deficits. The rule of law, the independence of the civil service, and free expression. And I'm going to examine the threats to free expression in India, and I'm going to outline 8 such. But before I outline these threats, I must ask a question, an important question. Should there be any limits to free speech? Or can anyone say what they want? What about hate speech? What about extolling Hitler? What about extolling Nathuram Godse? What, if any, should there be limits to free speech should there be? Let me quote Spinoza again, because he has some very wise things to say also about what are reasonable limits to free speech. He says, in the book I quoted earlier, which is his Theological and Political Treatise of 1670, he wrote, while a state must grant its citizens freedom of expression, it was, he argued, very dangerous to concede it without any restriction. For this reason, we must ask how far this freedom can and ought to be granted to every person so as to be consistent with the stability of the state. What are the limits to free expression? That for a society and a state to survive must be imposed. And I am going to argue that in searching for what reasonable limits could or should be to free expression, we can turn to Mahatma Gandhi, a homegrown philosopher, who in his book, whose book Hind Swaraj was banned by the British Raj in 1910, and in protesting the ban, he wrote in a letter which lies in the National Archives. This letter, by the way, is not in the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi. It was discovered by a very great historian called S.R. Mehrotra, and if there are any young historians here, S.R. Mehrotra is 87 years of age. He can't hear, but fortunately he can see. He lives in Shimla, and he tirelessly produces works of impeccable scholarship based on primary research in the archives, not on fancy theories of French and German philosophers, but hard work in the archives. I address this to all young scholars here. He's 87, he lives in Shimla, he wears a Himachali topi. Earlier this month, in collaboration with a young, brilliant historian called Dinyar Patel, he released his latest book, which is the collected works of Dadabhai Naoroji. So S.R. Mehrotra lives in Shimla, does his research. Often he takes the night train from Shimla, goes to the National Archives, works the whole day and takes the night train back. He still does this. And on one of these trips, he discovered a letter which, like the generous scholar he is, he shared with me. This is a letter that Gandhi wrote when the British government banned Hind Swaraj in 1910. This is in the National Archives, not in the collected works. And in this letter, in protesting the ban on his book, Gandhi writes, in my humble opinion, every man has a right to hold any opinion he chooses and to give effect to it also, so long as in doing so, he does not use physical violence against anybody. This is Gandhi's definition of what the limits to free speech should be. I will amend Gandhi's quote slightly, because he was using the gendered language of his time, and I would say, every man or woman has the right to hold any opinion he or she chooses and to give effect to it also, so long as in doing so, he or she does not use, and I would add, or advocate physical violence against anybody. So, with this caveat in place, that the only limit to free expression should be when a writer or an artist or a filmmaker advocates violence against other human beings, other citizens in his or her work, there should be free expression. But unfortunately in India, there are many limits and threats to free expression, and I'm going to now enumerate 8 that I've identified, not necessarily in order of importance, by the way, though I have a sense of which are more important than the others, but 8 important threats. The first threat to free expression in India is the retention of archaic colonial laws which have no place in an independent republic but are yet on the statute books. These sections that owe their origins to the Indian Penal Code of 1860 are often invoked to ban books, films, magazines, works of art. And these reactionary, archaic sections include Section 153, wantonly giving provocation, 153A, promoting enmity between different groups on grounds of religion, race, language, Section 295, defiling a place of worship, 295A, deliberate and malicious acts intended to outrage religious feelings, 298, uttering words with deliberate intent to wound the religious feelings of any person, Section 505, statements conducing to public mischief, and most dangerously, Section 124A, the so-called sedition clause, which goes, whoever by words either spoken or written, or by signs, or by visible representation or otherwise, brings or attempts to bring into hatred or contempt, or excites or attempts to excite a disaffection towards the government established by law in India, shall be published by imprisonment for life. Now, this is the most notorious section, the sedition section, used against, among others, Bal Gangadhar Tilak and Mahatma Gandhi. But the other sections also, which I've read out, give very wide latitude to courts or the state to limit free expression. Insulting a person's religious feelings, meaning to defile a place of worship, statements conducing to public mischief. Why isn't Arnab Goswami in the courts all the time? Right. Now, extraordinary wide latitude they give. And there's an irony here. The Indian Penal Code was drafted by Macaulay, a man detested by professed patriots and anti-imperialists. I have had the honor of being called a Macaulay Putra oftentimes by RSS people, right? Yet when it suits the RSS or the BJP or indeed the Congress, which also calls Macaulay an imperialist, they use his sections all the time. Gandhi, as I said, was a victim of these laws. He had hoped that they would be removed after independence, and in July 1929, he wrote an editorial in Young India, which you'll get online. If you just go Gandhi, Young India, 1929, section 124A, where he said, as soon as we get Swaraj, he wrote this in 1929, as soon as we get Swaraj, we will have to repeal the sedition law. Incidentally, this law was also the British statute books. The British have repealed it many decades ago, but we still have it. Now, not only have we retained these colonial sections, in some ways, we have even strengthened them. And an example here is the first amendment to the Constitution, passed in 1951, when Jawaharlal Nehru was Prime Minister and B.R. Ambedkar was Law Minister. This amendment was prompted by fears of the stability of the Indian state. Again, if I may address a couple of sentences specifically to the young people in this room. In 1947, India became independent. Less than 6 months after India became independent, the father of the nation was murdered by a right-wing Hindu fanatic. 6 weeks after Gandhi's murder, left-wing revolutionaries under the orders of Joseph Stalin, who when I last heard was not an Indian, mounted armed insurgency against the Indian state. So at its inception, the infant Indian state that had come into being after decades of struggle against an Indian ruler was threatened by right-wing fundamentalists and left-wing extremists at the same time. And in this context, Nehru, who was Prime Minister, Patel, who was Home Minister, and Ambedkar, who was Law Minister, were nervous about radical left-wing and right-wing attacks on the state, and came down not only on the insurgents, but also on the newspapers and the periodicals that represented the Hindutva and the communist point of view. And there were several court cases which lawyers have written about, legal scholars have written about, one against a left-wing journal called Crossroads, and other against a right-wing journal which still exists, The Organizer, where they published articles which were the state regarded as inflammatory. The court said no, this is freedom of expression, and in response to that, Nehru and Patel and Ambedkar brought in the First Amendment to the Constitution. Now, the original Constitution, as drafted by the Constitutional Assembly, had an article which specified that freedom of expression would be curbed only when it undermined the security or tends to overthrow the state. So this is advocating violence. So when you have someone advocating the overthrow of the state by violence, then the Constitution said, this is Article 19, said that you can curb that person's freedom of expression. However, the amendment introduced by Nehru, Patel and Ambedkar, three of our great icons, and largely merited their status as icons, but this is a blemish on their democratic credentials, this First Amendment, they replaced the clause which said, when it undermines the security or tends to overthrow the state with threats to morality, public order, and relations with foreign states. Public order is a very broad category. Morality, a very broad category, much broader than undermining the state, threatens to overthrow the state, very clear. Is a threat to public order, morality, relations with foreign states. This gave very wide latitude, again, to curb freedom of expression. And based on this First Amendment, several governments, state governments, more recently, have passed draconian laws putting in place further curbs on freedom of expression. One particularly notorious law is Chhattisgarh's Public Safety Act, under which many journalists, Hindi and English journalists, have been prosecuted. Now, one of the lessons of, I should say, one of the depressing lessons of studying the history of democratic states is that when, for whatever reason, an anti-democratic act is passed, that is never removed, even when the threat occasioning that act has disappeared. So you can understand in 1949 or 1950, after the murder of Mahatma Gandhi, after the horrible riots that accompanied partition, in light of the insurgency mounted by the Communist Party of India against the Indian state on the orders of Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Communist Party, you can understand why Nehru and Patel and Ambedkar felt nervous. But by 1960, we were absolutely secure, we were united, we'd had 2 general elections, the communists had come over ground, the RSS had come over ground, they formed their own parties, they were fighting democratic elections. Surely at some stage, Nehru or Shastri or Indira Gandhi or Vajpayee or Morarji Desai or Deve Gowda should have thought that such an amendment that gives such sweeping powers to curb freedom of expression should have no place in a democracy. But unfortunately, once the state, for whatever reason, is equipped with certain powers to harass citizens, it's very hard for the state to unburden itself of those punitive sanctions. So that's the first threat to freedom of expression. Archaic colonial laws tragically reinforced and consolidated in independent India. The second threat, which is related to the first, are imperfections in our judicial system. Lower courts, in particular, I would underline this, lower courts in particular are too quick and too eager to entertain petitions seeking the banning of a book or a work of art or a film, invoking those colonial era sections. And if you think of M.F. Hussain, and the multiple cases filed against him, usually they are in far-flung places. You know, they'll be filed, one in Indore, one in Davangere, one in, Varda, Supreme Court, are generally more sympathetic to freedom of expression. We've seen it recently in the case of Perumal Murugan, for example, where the Madras High Court passed an excellent judgment. Dangerous threat to freedom of expression is the rise and further rise of identity politics. In India today, the life of a book, in India today, the life of a book or a film or a work of art is increasingly captive to the ease with which any community whatsoever can complain that its sentiments are hurt by it. Grievance collectors. Every caste, every community, every linguistic group, every state has its own grievances. Alas, we don't merely collect grievances, we articulate them, impose them on others, thus throttling free expression. In India today, the icons of each region, each caste, each community have become immaculate, perfect, beyond any critical scrutiny whatsoever. That is true of Bose for the Bengalis, of Ambedkar for the Dalits, of Savarkar for the Hindutvawadis, of Shivaji for the Maharashtrians, and 100 other examples. And these are live historical figures. We're not talking about Lord Rama or Lord Jesus or the Prophet Muhammad. We're talking about people who lived in the last 50, 100, 200, 300 years, who had a visible impact on our history and our society, a very complex impact, sometimes admirable, sometimes not so admirable. And any society that does not permit critical, dispassionate analysis by writers, artists, and filmmakers of real historical figures is in serious danger of losing its democratic credentials. And that is what India has become today. And in an extraordinary irony, only Gandhi is free to be criticized by anyone. Because Mahatma Gandhi belongs to no one and to everyone. And it's open season on Gandhi. You can write whatever vicious attacks you have on Gandhi, no one will come forward to protect him. Which is or file a court case saying that your book should be banned or your film should be banned, which is in its own way a strange and remarkable tribute to Mahatma Gandhi. Now, along with the rise and further rise and even further rise of identity politics, we Indians have become an increasingly humorless people. And I'd like to give an example of this. I was in a literary festival recently where Farooq Dhondi told a joke. Farooq Dhondi is a Parsi writer originally from Pune. He told a joke that he had heard being told by Bapsi Sidhwa, who is a Parsi writer originally from Lahore. And in some conversation like this, Bapsi Sidhwa was asked, why are you Parsis so few in number? Why is your population declining? How can you arrest it? Bapsi is a woman. So she looked at the questioner and said, don't point fingers at me. It's all the fault of our men. Half of them are homosexual, and the other half are statues in Bombay. Now, when I heard this story, I of course laughed, as all of you did, and I recalled fondly and sadly and nostalgically my favorite Indian comic writer, now long dead, whom I grew up reading, who was the late Bairam contractor, also known as Busy Bee, who wrote in the Times of India, in the Afternoon Dispatch of Courier, and was continually mocking his fellow Parsis. The Parsis are the only community in India who can still laugh at themselves. I'm a Tamil Brahmin. Can I make a sarcastic remark about Rajagopalachari or about Tamils? I'll be lynched. I think this is a tragic consequence of the rise of identity politics. Not only that it's a major threat to free expression, critical scrutiny of our historical figures, but it is making us Indians humorless. And you see it all the time. I mean, this Vishal Dadlani, who's poor chap is in trouble for making, which in any civilized society would be a perfectly, kosher remark. Now I come to my fourth threat, which is serious and not funny. It's the behavior of the police force. Even when higher courts are on the side of writers and artists, the police side with the gundas who harass them. They just look on. I'll give you two examples, there could be many others. James Lane, who was an American historian, wrote a scholarly book on Shivaji, in which, without endorsing it, he passed on a tale which disputed Shivaji's parentage. This was enough for the book to be banned, for the Bhandarkar Institute, where Lane had done some of his research, to be vandalized, whereupon a case was filed among the few people who stood up at that time, and he was a very brave and remarkable Maharashtrian Indian liberal, now dead, was Dilip Chitre, who stood up against Islamic fundamentalists, Hindu fundamentalists, Maharashtrian fundamentalists, whatever. And a case was filed by some of these liberals in the Bombay High Court, which overturned the ban. But the OUP, which was the publisher, and I think one of the representatives somewhere here, was too scared to stock the book because the police would not give them protection. In Ahmedabad, when our Honorable Prime Minister at that time was Chief Minister of that state, of Gujarat, a very remarkable collaboration between a great architect and a great artist known as the Hussain Doshi Guha, which some of you might have visited. It's in the School of Architecture in Ahmedabad, was vandalized because Bajrang Dalis were told that Hussain is anti-Hindu, and the police just looked up. And you could get dozens of examples. It would happen anywhere. It would happen in any state. Congress ruled, BJP ruled, Trinamool Congress ruled, AIDMK ruled, whatever. CPM ruled, whatever. The fifth threat, which is again linked to this, is the pusillanimity and occasionally malevolence of Indian politicians. No major Indian politician, no major Indian political party, I would amend that, no major or minor Indian politician, no major or minor Indian political party has ever consistently supported writers, artists and filmmakers against thugs and bigots. I've told you about Rajiv Gandhi and static verses. I've told you about Narendra Modi and M.F. Hussain. I've told you about Jayalalitha and Perumal Murugan, and add to that list Jyoti Basu and Taslima Nasreen. Communist chief ministers are as guilty of this kind of kowtowing to fundamentalists and bigots. And it will remain a serious blot on the CPM regime. Of course, there are several other blots, but this one, since they claim to be scholars and intellectuals, Buddhadeva Bhattacharya used to write, I think, poems or plays in his spare time, but yet he was too scared to protect the rights of Taslima Nasreen. Politicians bow down before bigots and sometimes use state power to bully editors and journalists. There are phone calls made often to proprietors by powerful politicians. There are one or two exceptions to this in terms of media houses, but I'll let that pass. But anyone who writes for the newspapers knows this. So that's the fifth threat. The sixth threat is linked again to the fifth, the dependence of the media on government advertisements. And this is particularly acute in the regional and the sub-regional press. If I am running a Kannada newspaper in Dharwad, dealing with local issues, right? Bidli, Sadak, Pani, governance, and corruption, development, Hindu-Muslim harmony, the rights of Dalits. Inevitably, I depend quite a lot on the ads provided by the government of Karnataka for tenders, for jobs. And if I am critical of a local MLA or local minister, these ads will be pulled. This is particularly acute in the case of the regional and sub-regional press. The dependence of the media on government advertisements, which makes them, impedes them in being frank and fearless in their scrutiny of government policy, state government policies. The seventh threat, which operates more at the level of large Hindi newspapers like Dainik Bhaskar, Dainik Jagran, or large English newspapers like Hindustan Times, Times of India, and so on, is the dependence of the media on commercial advertisements. Of course, this applies even more to television. These newspapers and television channels, Times Now, CNN IBN, India Today, Aaj Tak, ABP News, which cater to people like us in this room, relatively affluent middle-class audiences, their dependence on commercial advertisements is a serious curb on the freedom of expression that the reporters or the editors or their writers or their columnists can exercise. Companies that make products which may have damaging effects are rarely criticized for fear that ads will be pulled. Not only notoriously thin-skinned companies like the Reliance, but even the Tatas, who are professedly the most professional and non-partisan of Indian corporate houses, have been known to pull ads from the media channels that run well-researched stories that may be critical of some of these companies' actions or products or activities. And a field in which this has happened, in which I know, a field I know particularly well, is environmental journalism. Mr. Vajpayee was kind enough to mention my early work in environmental history. And that was inspired by a generation of remarkable environmental journalists, such as the late Anil Agarwal, Kalpana Sharma, Daryl DeMonte, Usha Rai, Shekhar Pathak and Kuvan, these all in English, Shekhar Pathak and Kuvan Prasoon and Rajkumar Keswani in Hindi, all quite remarkable writers. Kuvan Prasoon and Shekhar Pathak did the best work on Chipko Andolan. Rajkumar Keswani, as Ashok Vajpayee will know, exposed the Bhopal gas leak. Quite extraordinary writers in Indian languages or in English. They really pioneered the environmental movement in India. And in the 80s, they were given space. From the 90s onwards, with economic liberalization, there was pressure. As late as 1995, every major Indian newspaper had an environmental correspondent. By the time the 21st century dawned, these had either been laid off or redesignated stock market correspondents. So the pressure exercised, because of the dependence on commercial ads, is an inhibiting factor in critical analysis of companies. Now, I've given you 7 threats, and I'm going to just refresh your memory before I come to my last threat. The first threat to freedom of expression in India is the retention, and in the case of the First Amendment, the consolidation of archaic colonial laws that have no place in a self-styled democracy. The second threat imperfections in our judicial system, particularly the readiness of lower courts to entertain frivolous or malevolent petitions. The third threat, the rise and further rise of identity politics. The fourth threat, the behavior of the police force, who are complicit in attacks on writers and artists and filmmakers. The fifth threat, the pusillanimity of politicians. The sixth threat, the dependence of the media, particularly the regional media and the sub-regional media, on government ads. The seventh threat, the dependence of the media, particularly the big media, the corporate media, on commercial ads. And this brings me to my last threat, which we have to look within. The eighth threat to freedom of expression in India is constituted by careerist or ideologically driven writers, artists, and filmmakers. George Orwell once said, "A writer must never be a loyal member of a political party." To which I would add the amendment: a writer or an artist or filmmaker must never be even a disloyal member of a political party. Tragically, in India, too many writers, scholars, editors identify with a single party, or even more tragically, with a single politician, thus twisting or suppressing facts in what they write or print. This betrayal occurs across the spectrum. There are writers who are propagandists for the Bharatiya Janata Party, writers who are spokesmen for the Congress, writers who are apologists for the Communist Party of India Marxist, writers who are useful idiots for the Naxalites. Sometimes this suppression takes place because of ideological bias. I can't criticize my party, right? I admire Narendra Modi, so I can't allow any criticism of him. I admire the Congress and what it stood for, so I must dilute criticism of Rahul Gandhi. Sometimes it occurs because of ideological bias. I have to be loyal to the CPM, so I won't say anything about the expulsion of Taslima Nasreen. At other times, it is caused by plain corruption. Almost every editor or proprietor in India would be happy to have a Rajya Sabha seat, or if not that, at least subsidized government accommodation in Lutyens, Delhi. But the corruption is easy. Corruption is ubiquitous in our society. I'm more concerned about the ideological biases. Too many of my contemporaries, there are a few exceptions. One of them is, I should mention a few remarkable journalists, and I'm speaking more of English because that's what I do. One of them, who's my exact contemporary, is a man called Paranjoy Guha, who has retained his integrity and his independence from political parties in 35 years of his working life. I first met him in 1974 when I met him with two of his contemporaries who went to the same school and appeared for the same examination, the ISC, and they were known as 5, 6, and 7 because that's the points they got in the ISC. And three of them were always together. All three became journalists. Paranjoy remains the only honest one of those three. At 33% is a high percentage, by the way. You won't find it. In my sample is biased towards honest journalists. Right. Okay, in this sense. The older they get, the more compromised they become. And I think that is what is tragic about. And it's not just true of journalists, it's true of writers, it's true of filmmakers. They identify with particular politicians, particular parties, out of party loyalty. I think the Taslima Nasreen case is particularly shameful. And the left silence on this, and the acquiescence in it. The most prominent left-wing intellectuals of the city, who are always, at dharna at the top of a hat. MF Hussain, they will protest. Good, I applaud that. But Taslima Nasreen, they will not protest. I think this is the kind of ideological biases that have deeply damaged our own profession. If we want freedom of expression for writers, or for artists or filmmakers, we should defend the freedom of expression of a writer or an artist filmmaker to whom we are otherwise ideologically or personally or whatever viscerally opposed. Now I have outlined 8 threats to freedom of expression. These singly and collectively undermine India's democratic credentials. Certainly, our writers, artists and filmmakers enjoy far greater freedoms than their counterparts in semi-totalitarian countries like China or Russia. If I was a Chinese intellectual, I could not be giving this lecture in Beijing. If I was a Russian intellectual and I've named all kinds of people. I've named Rajiv Gandhi, Narendra Modi, I can name a few more. I haven't even named Indira Gandhi yet, but I am happy to. That'll have to be a separate discussion on dictatorial tendencies. So clearly, we are freer than many countries in the world. Vietnam, Cuba, Singapore, Russia, Ukraine, whatever. But we are distinctly unfree. Writers, artists, filmmakers in India are freer than their counterparts in totalitarian countries like China or Russia, but we are distinctly unfree when compared to our counterparts in thoroughbred democracies like Sweden or Canada. That's, I think, a point I would like to underline. I'd like to end with a question which clearly has been on my mind, it's been on some people's mind. Is the situation worse today than it was in the past? Clearly, there was no golden age. Jawaharlal Nehru and B.R. Ambedkar and Vallabhbhai Patel introduced the First Amendment. Indira Gandhi's record you all know with the emergency. Rajiv Gandhi banned satanic verses. The left has played, as I've said, extremely reactionary part when it comes to freedom of expression. Are we worse off today than we were before May 2014? I want to end with that question. I believe there was no golden age. There were always these 8 threats operating in varying degrees of severity. But today, we may be marginally worse off. And I'm going to outline two reasons why I think India today is less free when it comes to freedom of expression than it was 2 or 3 or 5 years ago. The first has to do with the fact that the threats to writers, artists and filmmakers are no longer restricted to the banning of books or the burning of books or the censoring of films or the vandalizing of artworks. Now, writers and artists are actually killed for their views, physically assassinated. 3 examples are that of Narendra Dabolkar, and Govind Pansare in Maharashtra, and of course, Kalburgi in my home state. Now, these vary. Dabolkar was killed when the Congress was in power in Maharashtra and in the center. Pansare was killed when the BJP was in power in Maharashtra and the center. Kalburgi was killed when the Congress was in power in Karnataka and the BJP was in power in the center. But this is a qualitatively new thing, the physical assassination of writers. In my view, there are 2 other similarities. One, which is reasonably obvious, is that Dabolkar, Pansare and Kalburgi were particularly reviled by Hindu fundamentalists. And it's very likely, we can't be sure, that the assassins belong to that political point of view, which makes India a tragic mirror of Bangladesh, where Islamic fundamentalists are killing independent-minded writers and artists and filmmakers. So that's one aspect of those murders. The other aspect, which I urge you to reflect on, what unites Dabolkar, Kalburgi and Pansare is that not one of them wrote in English. I may be tempting fate here, but I still like to say, writers in English are relatively safer than writers in Indian languages. Partly because they may have an intellectual reputation to protect them, partly because their views don't influence voting behavior. So that's the first way in which things may be slightly worse. 3 is not a large number. In Bangladesh, it's probably 30 or 40 or 60. In China, it will be in these hundreds, either purged or sent to death camps or to gulags. In Russia, Soviet Russia, it have been thousands. So 3 is not a very large number, but it's there. Journalists are also there. If I was to add journalists to this, we're talking about writers, established writers, but attacks on journalists. I haven't talked very much about it. I talked about environment. Let me just add a caveat, because I talked about environmental journalism. The areas of India that are most unfree are the mining districts. Bellary in my home state, Bastar in Madhya Pradesh, in Orissa, Jharkhand. This is where the rule of law does not prevail at all. And in the past, it was lucrative minerals like iron and bauxite that led to this kind of thing. Now sand mining, river mining, and the journalists write about it. In MP, in Karnataka, there have been attacks and threats. So this is a trend that is increasing. I mentioned only the prominent writers. But the vulnerability of journalists, I think we are, when I checked last, I think we are ranked 130th on the Press Freedom Index. Right. Now, so that's the first way in which we may be worse off. I'd say even before the BJP came to power, it's the last 5 or 10 years, 10, 15 years, we've been, probably this has increased. Physical attacks, not just censorship or having books burnt, but actually the elimination of writers and artists and journalists. The second way in which the situation may be worse is that the government now in power in New Delhi is arguably, or perhaps not even arguably, indubitably, the most anti-intellectual and Philistine ever to rule this country. And I say this advisedly. I mean, look at the appointments. The question is not, why Smriti Irani was made education minister. Why did she hold that job for 2 years? I mean, if you talk, I say this with anguish. Again, I said that as a writer in English, I am somewhat insulated from threats because I write in English and I may have an international reputation. As a person who does not teach in an Indian university, I am also insulated from the harassment and intimidation by Philistine ministers in Delhi. But if I look at my colleagues in my own university, University of Delhi, or in the IITs, and the stories I hear of how they are treated by ministers and bureaucrats, and the views, the public views of people such as our fortunately late education minister and our unfortunately extant culture minister. Now, what does this tell you? It tells you it goes down the line. The appointments of Sudarshan Rao, the ICHR, Gajendra Chauhan to the Film Institute, Pankaj Nihalani, Chetan Chauhan to the Fashion Institute. You can go on and on. I mean, the person who apparently is going to head the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, a place headed by great historians like B.R. Nanda and Ravindra Kumar, gives you a sense of how anti-intellectual and Philistine this government is. I have a new book coming out next week in which my lecture today will be one of the essays. But there's also an essay in that book which asks, where are the conservative intellectuals in India? And I say this with some anguish. I'm a liberal. I'm not a leftist, I'm not a rightist, I'm a liberal. But if you look at any sophisticated democracy in this world, Germany, Britain, United States, they are right-wing intellectuals who are serious and credible. And we once had that tradition. We once had that tradition. If you think of the people who clustered around C. Rajagomalachari in the Swatantra Party, if you go further back to historians like Jadunath Sarkar and Radha Kumar Mukherjee, I mean, there is a credible intellectual tradition that can call itself conservative, that emphasizes family, community, traditional ways of being, that is often rightly skeptical of hasty change and wanton disregard of institutions that have survived for a very long time. But in India, it doesn't exist. There is not a single credible conservative intellectual in India, with the possible exception of Arun Shuri, and the fact that he's been so comprehensively shunned by this government, that the one thinking person they may have on their side, tells you quite a lot about how profoundly Philistine and anti-intellectual this government is when it comes to films, works of art, literature, scholarship, and our public, I mean, the way in which our best institutions have been treated. The Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, if you think of the harassment they faced, and some of the IITs, I think in that sense, possibly we are slightly worse. But I would underline only slightly worse. There was never a golden age for the freedom of expression in India. Past regimes, past parties, past prime ministers have also never stood up for freedom of expression. But it is arguably marginally worse today. 10 years ago, I called India a 50-50 democracy. I leave you today with a slightly depressing conclusion that our democratic credentials may have slipped further. We are now a 40-60 democracy. Thank you.
Well, friends, after this brilliant and provocative lecture by Professor Guha, although he does not profess in any university, there's time for you to ask questions, if you have any. Let them be brief.
Yeah. Before, just put it on the Professor Guha. Mr. Vajpayee is much older than me, but we had one close mutual friend, Ramachandra Guha,
Yeah.
who used to call himself the Professor of Philosophy at Nathu Sweets. I am the Professor of Philosophy at Koshi's Parade Cafe, Bangalore. Professor of History, I beg your pardon.
Yeah, there you are. So please raise your hands. We'll try to reach the mic. Ask brief questions. Let them be a little witty. Don't get too damn serious, no? And don't give opinions. Just ask questions for clarification. Yes.
Yeah.
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 Yes.
I have a mic, so I have a right to
Yeah,
speak first. Yeah. Thank you very much. Exceptional, and thank you for saying those wonderful words about Paranjal, a very close friend. Thank you very, very much. I was wondering if you'd like to spend a little time telling us if it actually the problem is freedom of expression, or we just lost a sense of expression of freedom.
That's a beautiful question, and it's appropriate for in the lecture in memory of a philosopher. Wit, irony, humor are also expression of freedom. So we are losing some of that. The nuances, the touches. Sure, I mean I accept that. We're also perhaps losing that, and that's of course to do with our time. I think we have to have a lighter touch. Often even serious points can be made in, without not in a solemn way. So I would accept that. Yeah.
Yes.
Anna, go ahead.
Do utter your names, please.
Sir, all the 8 freedoms of art threats that you have mentioned, I think the underlying is the character. There's self-interest, whether it is politician, whether it is policeman, whether it is fundamentalist, whether it is a journalist of commercial or government. You look at it, the self-interest and character is what, or the example you gave of your friend Prananji or something. I think it's ultimately the character of the people which are responsible for the kind of society we create. And I think if as a behavior science professional, I would say it is not easy to get people in leadership position who are a very high character. So I think the real question is how you can get people in leadership position who have character. So I think all this comes from there.
Mr. Guha, just 2 points on which I disagreed with you. The first is the very first point that all the Indian Penal Code provisions should be abolished, those which are in against freedom of expression. Now, 153A is an exception. I can tell you from the time when I was a subdivisional magistrate in 1951 that this section is needed for avoiding trouble between the communities, and that this continues to be required today. I would certainly say that it needs to be redefined to limit its apparently wide ambit, and it should be made like the sedition law now as defined by the Supreme Court. It should be subject to only when it provokes action or riots. The second point is at the very last of are things worse today? Look, they are worse. One particular example will tell you that when before have we had vigilantes taking up issues perpetually on behalf of the country and then getting support from the government? That I have in mind the JNU case. The ABVP appoints itself the arbiter of nationalism, and then it says to the government, prosecute such and such people or expel them because they're not nationalists. This goes beyond anything that we have ever had before.
Thank you, Mr. Mazda, for this. On the first point, I think I'm not a legal expert. You may be right. I mean, as someone who's been in the field trying to manage a sensitive and complex situation. But the ambit it gives to the courts to interpret them loosely, in the absence of clear directions of the political authority. You know, how would a book by Peter Hees or Aurobindo lead to a communal right? You know, for example, you know, in that sense, yeah. On your second point, I also agree, and I think this is part of it. The tragedy of what happened in Hyderabad. There were two tragedies of what happened in Hyderabad in jail. One was the ABVP was leading the government. The education minister was led by the ABVP. The second tragedy, which is unnoticed, is that JNU, and which I think ABVP people and if there are any, I hope there are some BJP supporters in this room. I won't ask you to raise your hands, but I hope some of you are here. So you should know this. Because the line when someone like me says that the BJP is anti-intellectual, I am told, तुम तो humanities वाले हो, तुमको science में admission नहीं मिला तो BA करना पड़ा. Right. That's a standard line. Okay. So I'm glad that they respect scientists. JNU and Hyderabad University have the best departments of science in any of our public universities. They're not just left-wing Marxists, they're top-class physicists and biologists and chemists. They're the people you are destroying. Also, by letting the ABVP decide your policy. So I think that point is very important. I think this is that it is it's not you know that what happened at JNU and in Hyderabad University was it was not the RSS, it was not the PMO, it was not the education based, the ABVP that was deciding. It's quite extraordinary. You know the depths that we plumbed and the kind of what we may have unleashed and how we may have made the, and you know, I think this again is something very important, which I think again every young person must understand. It's very difficult to build institutions, it's very easy to destroy or damage them. And if the best of our public universities like JNU and Hyderabad, their university, are threatened or undermined in this way, it will be very hard to put them back together.
Young man.
I see that's a larger, profound question.
Since being a student, I have like a very regular reader of your books. Since I come from JNU now, so like, and just there was election yesterday, and now we are like in the race, and now I see that is the third point you are raising, the threat of identity politics. And now there is an organization on the campus, BAPSA, they claim it like a Mr. Ambedkar Police Student Association.
Yeah.
And United Left, there was a front. Election scenario was that United Left came together saying that we want to like push up identity outside the campus so that we would have strength. But then BAPSA came out very strongly, asserting that left hasn't addressed our issues, even though they might have talked about it.
Yes.
Meaning, the kind of hypocrisy they might have felt on the campus. I really wonder, like this, the kind of freedom of expression you are talking about. Like, my only point about the identity politics is, even though it limits to the extent, because at all levels you find fundamentalism, you know, across the religions, caste, and all, you find all across, right? But then, that was, I was just wondering, identity that BAPSA organization, when I had heard his speech, presidential candidate, he was like prioritizing certain issues which never was a priority of the left. And prioritization is actually identity politics, I think what I see. And now if we want to banish identity politics in its totality, it means like...
I think it's a very important question. And as a student, you know, I think it's important for you to recognize that history rarely operates in black and white. You know, Hitler is all black. But there are very few examples of all white. And they say the Buddha, but we don't know because it's so far back. Mohandas Gandhi was largely white, but not all white. I can tell you as his biographer. So history rarely operates. You know, history operates incrementally, like today. To go back to my talk, in some ways we are freer as a society. You know, women have more rights whom they want to marry than they did 20 years ago. Fortunately, right? But in terms of intellectual freedom, we are less. So identity politics, part of it is salutary. The important contribution of identity politics is that it has brought to the fore remarkable people unjustly neglected by the nationalist or the communist narrative. And three of these people are Birsa Munda, B.R. Ambedkar and Jyotirao Phule, hence Bapsa. However, so that's the salutary contribution to identity politics. On the other hand, the identity politics of the left, which is what we talk about, like the identity politics of the right, is excessively touchy about its heroes. Ambedkar cannot be touched, Phule cannot be touched, just as Savarkar and Golwalkar cannot be touched. This is not healthy for a democracy, is what I'm trying to say. That I'm not saying all identity politics bad. It may be necessary, valuable, a corrective to the condescension of the upper caste or Marxist narrative. However, any movement that is not open to self-criticism and scrutiny even of its most revered figures has a problem.
एक तो मैं आपका ये शुक्रिया अदा करूं कि आपने हिंदी वालों और जो बाकी हिंदुस्तान की जो रीजनल लैंग्वेजेज हैं उनकी कदर की अंग्रेजी वाले आमतौर पे करते नहीं हैं। हालांकि आपने इस रेफरेंस में की कि मरने के काबिल भी जो हैं आज तो वही रह गए हैं क्योंकि उनकी पहुंच ज्यादा है, पर मैं इसको कॉम्प्लीमेंट की तरह लेता हूँ। तो हम लोग इसको जूझ भी रहे हैं लेकिन उनकी पहुंच ज्यादा है। पर एक चीज जो आपने कही, जो 3 लेखक मारे गए एक के बाद एक, मेरा मानना है जितना भी आजादी के बाद में जो भी हुआ, लेकिन ये जो वक्त है वर्ष इसलिए है कि पहले कभी भी राइटर अरेस्ट किए गए, ह्यूमिलेट किए गए, लेकिन एक के बाद एक 3 राइटर्स मारे कभी नहीं गए, पहली बात। दूसरी बात ये मानना कि ये तो बीजेपी जब ये मूवमेंट हुआ और अशोक जी और हम लोगों ने जब प्रतिरोध वाला यहाँ पे एक प्रोटेस्ट ऑर्गेनाइज किया तब लोगों ने ये कहा था कि ये लोग उस वक्त तो वहाँ पे कांग्रेस की सरकार थी, फलानी का फला की थी, पर आइडियोलॉजी तो एक थी ना जिनके तहत मारे गए। बड़ी बात ये है कि वो जो आइडियोलॉजी है, हम एग्री करें या न करें, बहुत से लोग आपने कहा कि एग्री करने वाले भी होंगे, लेकिन किस तरह से उनको मारने का हक मिल गया। वो गांधी को चाहे कुछ भी कर दें, उनके बारे में कुछ भी हो, लेकिन गोडसे के नाम पे पुल बन गया रातों रात। और आपने देखा होगा कि तस्वीर कल अखबारों में छपी है, को गणेश जी को ही उन्होंने जो है चड्डी पहना दी, वो काली टोपी पहनी हुई है, जूते भी पहने हुए उन्होंने, हालांकि अब हाफ पैंट जो है वो खुद बदल दी गई है। ये जो चीजें हो रही हैं, ये मेरा मानना ये है कि आपने जो 40-60 कहा है, थोड़ा आप लिबरल हैं, तो मेरे ख्याल में आप जरूर से ज्यादा लिबरल हो रहे हैं।
Professor Guha,
I'll just make one point in response to what you said. You know, I don't disagree with what you said. However, you know, it's the crimes and culpability and the errors of the left and the Congress that have given legitimacy to the right wing. It is because of Arjun Singh that we had Murli Manohar Joshi and this Vidya and Guru Raza. No, I once wrote that Murli Manohar Joshi was a very good Leninist. He learned from the Leninists how to infiltrate state institutions. So I think that's why we have to recognize that it is that so-called liberals and leftists never stood up for these principles consistently. If Taslima Nasreen had not been thrown out, and if Jyoti Basu and Buddhadeb Bhattacharya had stood up for our rights, this BJP regime would not have been able to take her. And that's of course it's worse, but we have given our so-called leftists have given legitimacy. Yeah.
Professor Guha, Professor, it's here.
Yeah.
It's me.
Yeah.
During the time when Jashwant Singh's book was banned in Gujarat,
Yeah.
Jinnah,
Yeah.
Karan Thapar asked that time National Security Advisor, Rajesh Mishra, because that time Vajpayee, since then he had taken it. So he asked, Karan Thapar asked Mr. Rajesh Mishra, that since this book has been banned, what do you think Mr. Vajpayee would stand, Mr. Vajpayee's stand would have been, had he been able to comprehend what was happening? Mr. Rajesh Mishra said he was my boss, but whatever I know about him, he would have answered as an answer for a book should be a book.
Yeah.
So latest we have seen a different kind of threat to freedom of expression, different and new kind of threat. Like latest, I think yesterday, day before yesterday, I was reading a newspaper in which it was told, it was printed that NBT, National Book Trust, is not going to reprint Bipin Chandra's book.
Yeah.
So do you think this is a different kind of threat? And if BJP and the ruling regime has any kind of objection, don't you think that it should be confronted by another book?
You see, Vajpayee's remark was reported कि किताब का जवाब किताब होना चाहिए. That's a sensible thing. I wish he had said it loudly and directly at every Independence Day speech. You know, not just privately to Rajesh Krishna, he had said it every Independence Day speech. Also, he had said, film ka jawab film se hona chahiye. You know, because many of the things happened under his watch, including of Hussain and so on, right? But that's a principle we can follow. You see, NPT's question is very common, very complex. Because if I was to tell you stories about how the leftists, including Bipan Chandra, abused the NPT, we won't stop this session. You know, this goes back to what I said about home. You know, it's the misuse of public funds and public institutions by the leftists that has given license to the BJP. And this is something which every young person there should understand. Had it not been for what Nurul Hasan and Arjun Singh did in systematically promoting their friends, their cronies, their chamchas, and at the expense of better and more capable scholars. In university after university, institutional, the only difference is the Arjun Singhs and the Nurul Hasans promoted second-class scholars instead of first-class scholars. The BJP can't even call on third-class scholars. That's the way.
Dr. Guha, my name is Utkarsh. I first heard you at the Young India Fellowships. Good to see you again. My question is, do you think the emergence of technology platforms is helping to cause the freedom of expression, or it's pushing it back? And just like an unrelated question, in your words, you're a lapsed Marxist who criticizes the Indian left, Congress and BJP. So do you have friends?
I have lots of friends. Look at Tony. I have lots of friends. Yeah. My answer to the young man there from JNU. Any new process, product, movement, agitation has complex impacts. In some ways, social media and technology enabling. It's democratizing. But it's also led to, as memorably said, a kind of gigantic expression of egotism and bad taste. A lot of it is egotism and bad taste and visceral abuse. I mean, I don't know. I don't think. Again, we are behind. I mean, we are not. I don't think the social media. There's a German scholar here. It can't be as bad as India. And some of the misogyny on social media, is awful. I get trolled a lot, but I get trolled much less than women who have my views. And some of the women who get trolled more than me are Hindu women, Hindu by birth. So they get trolled much less than Muslim or Christian women who happen to have the same view. Just happen to have a name which signals their religion. So it's a complex thing. What is the impact of technology? At one level is liberating. But at the one level, clearly 140 characters you can't do. Nuance and complexity is lost totally. It's all name calling. Right? If you look at some of the other examples in Facebook, I was reading today an article. I'm not on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, but I'm not on Facebook. I was reading an article in The Guardian of how Mark Zuckerberg is censoring certain things when he wants to please the Chinese. There's a long essay on this, right? That there's certain posts he's taken down, right? So these are how complex and we have to wait. But we have to see technology can be, but ultimately to go back to the gentleman's question about character, you do need, one would need the kind of commitment, institutionalized commitment in public institutions, in the courts, and of course in the political class, if you were to further this. I mean, I didn't have time in my talk, but if I may just give an example. There's an example I want to give in my talk, but I think it's there in the essay in my book that's coming. In 2009 and 2010, when Dr. Manmohan Singh was Prime Minister, a proposal was sent to him, or sent to the PMO, I presume it may have reached him, which said, at that stage Hussain was in exile. Salman Rushdie was not allowed to come back to India. And the proposal was sent to the PMO, which said, award Hussain a Bharat Ratna. At the same time, award Salman Rushdie a Padma Vibhushan, which is a just acknowledgement of their respective merits, Bharat Ratna, and would be an equal opportunity offense to bigots. In both Hindu bigots and Muslim bigots would be offended. You've taken care of the mullahs and the Sanghis together because you honored Hussain and Rushdie. Right. Now, this proposal was sent. I don't know whether it reached Dr. Singh. It was sent twice, possibly. Right. If Dr. Singh had the intelligence to understand the merit of the proposal, the current Prime Minister or Dr. Singh's predecessor may not have. I don't know, maybe Vajpayee did, I'm not sure. But would they have the courage? No, that kind of thing. Here was an example where it's a matter of eternal shame that our greatest living artists have died in exile. much more than Rushdie, who's not really an engineer in that sense. But if this had been done, I mean, if a brave politician had said, I'm going to invite Hussain and Rushdie together, you have had a joint protest by, the already a Muslim person law board in Bazanga. Okay, that's what happened. So, ultimately, you would need something like this.
Yeah, good evening, sir. My name is Nishan. You have talked a little about environment also. This is a little bit different question. Just I wanted to know about the connection between the alternative media and the environmental concerns. We have worked a lot upon environmental history also. We have talked a little on that. So just I wanted to know, we are living in the days where mainstream media is being hit to, like Gurugram Jam over the, they are giving preferences over the Gurugram Jam over the Kosi's floods and Assam floods. So what do you think? Alternative media is saving the environmental concerns? Is it so? Or what's your take? Just I wanted to.
I think that's also a link to the question of technology. I think the alternative media, has the potential to take it forward. Partly because it may be less dependent in the same. Though, of course, a viable commercial model has not been worked out. You need to pay reporters to go to take photographs. But certainly, one of the great advantages of new media is visual imagery and environmental devastation. Visual imagery is so important in capturing it. But you would still need brave editors who can send people to cover the Kosi floods, chemical contamination. But that possibility exists, and there's some very fine writers. There's some of the really outstanding young environmental writers who are often women. Chitrangala Chaudhary is one, Bahar Bhatt is another, and there are several others. I'm sure the others are not. Nitin Sethi, who writes for Business Standard, is a very good reporter. But it's a shrinking space. You want so maybe the new websites will take it up and give it more visibility.
This side.
Lady there.
Over here.
To the lady. The only lady.
There is a lady here also. Two here also.
Oh, yeah.
My name is Shreya. I graduated from Oxford University with a master's in contemporary India, which is affiliated to the School of Interdisciplinary Area Studies. I just had a query regarding your very provocative parting shot of the 40-60% and the fact that democracy has fallen by 10%. I just wanted to ask whether decisions such as Shreya Singhal versus Union of India, where the judiciary struck down a very draconian provision, Section 66A of the Information Technology Act, or decisions such as NALSA, the National Legal Services Authority decision, which gave constitutional and legal recognition to the third gender in India, and of course the Perumal Murugan decision. Do you believe these decisions would have been possible prior to the 1990s?
That is a question I'm not competent to answer. I'm not a legal historian. Professor Upendra Bakshi was here or someone else, they'll be interesting, they'll be able to answer it. But I did say in my talk that the higher courts, generally, not always, there are exceptions, take the side of freedom of expression. The problem is that the police or the administration will not enforce it. But Perumal Murugan still cannot return to his hometown because the government won't protect him. So, it is a good judgment, a brave judgment, it is much quoted, rightly quoted, but that problem.
So over here.
Hi. Let me take four more questions.
Thanks for this. I've been hearing you since you gave that great lecture in 1993 in the Lal Bahadur Shastri Academy. You might forget, but we've been following you. In one of these seminars in Pakistan, somebody answered this question on freedom of expression, saying, "Why are you asking us about freedom of expression? Of course, we have great freedom of expression. It is freedom after expression that is the problem." So, my question is that if somebody like the president of our ruling party says that criticism of the country will not be accepted, then where does it? What does it mean? And do I then have the right to say that we have horrible nutrition standards in India and get away with it?
No, I think it's you know, as someone, let me say this, that as someone who has never supported the BJP, hearing the president of the BJP speak makes me nostalgic, not just for Atal Bihari Vajpayee, for Daya Krishna money. I've never thought I would. By the way, so it's a sign of our age, because I never thought, but see, Rahul Gandhi, I'm sometimes nostalgic even for Indira Gandhi. But that's okay, maybe a sign of my age in respect. But you know, I think the anti-Philistinism of you know, the current regime, I mean, even more than Narendra Modi, the BJP party president encapsulates it. I mean, without question. I mean, absolutely no doubt about that. I mean, it is disturbing.
Yes. So, over here. Good evening, sir. My name is Pranav Pal. I'm from Mayo College. Sir, this discussion being mostly centered about the perils of censorship that scholars have to face. So my question is, can censorship be ever good? Can, you know, in the name of national interest, what we are seeing for quite a while in terms of Subhash Chandra Bose, almost in a similar tone when it said that it might impair India's relations with other countries, can there be ever merits if sensibly handled within the realm of censorship?
As I said, only if something actually advocates the use of violence. You know, there's a case. But that's not what how things are interpreted by judges in the lower courts or by our laws, or above all by our politicians. You know what I'm saying? Who is to define what is the national interest? You know, Samuel Johnson, this goes back to, I commented on this at the time of this JNU and fiasco, when I saw the statements not just of Smriti Irani but of our Home Minister. I said Samuel Johnson said patriotism is the last refuge of the scoundrel. In India, it's the first refuge of the incompetent. That's what it is. So I think, so to invoke nationalism, I mean, if it advocating violence, criticism of the country will not be tolerated. Who is the Karta Nata of the country? I mean, they should go back. I mean, someone, who mentioned NBT, by the way? Someone mentioned NBT. You know, there's a wonderful book edited by Sabyasachi Bhattacharya, The Mahatma and the Poet. Yes. It's a letter between Tagore and Gandhi. And Tagore made Gandhi less of a xenophobe and more of an internationalist. It's a remarkable book. Because it's published by the NBT, it's at a price every Indian can afford. Because it's published by the NBT, no Indian knows where to find it. That's also true. But please read it.
Hi, my name is Radhika. I'm an activist from Rajasthan. I work with Aruna Roy. We were recently campaigning for an accountability law in Rajasthan. And I'm completely in agreement when you say that the First Amendment should have been repealed and that these sections need to be looked at. But I just want to bring to light a certain incident that happened in January of this year. A group of us were physically attacked by a mob that was led, most of them were Bajrangi, and that was led by a Bajrangi sitting MLA. And we've been fighting the legal battle. And we really were made aware that the first time in about 15 years of his political career, where he's committed several hundreds of such incidences, the only section in which he's recently been sentenced under, not yet in, obviously, but was the 153 and 153A. In such instances, there isn't a black or white. What, in your opinion, could be a remedy? Should we, in entirety, get rid of such sections, or should we be speaking about certain legal remedies and legislative processes that will safeguard artists, writers, and scholars, rather than leaving it open to everybody?
No, I think the latter, obviously. I mean, obviously, they would have to be. I said, I'm not a legal scholar. I just feel worried that these sections that exist give too much attention to the courts. There may be other sections in which, for example, physically attacking. I mean, I'm sure Ashok once early in his career was implemented the IPC. Mr. Mazumdar, there's some other IAS officers here. There might be other sections under which you can prosecute a gunda who beats up peaceful social activists. You don't have to invoke the 153 years surely. There will be other sections.
In another case, okay.
Yeah. So I think my worry is that they give very wide latitude and can have been misused. That's really
yes. Yeah, I'm Axel Hanna, from the Heinrich Böll Foundation here in Delhi. I want to take a little step back from the current politics and to have a more general question to the historian, Joanne. When you brought this list of 8 threats to freedom of expression in India, most of them, virtually all of them, are circling around institutions, the institutional setup, high-level structures and actors, and so on. And I was just wondering, what about actually the constituency for freedom of expression? Who actually wants it? I think there's a very classic, the question, how far does this constituency go in India? I think there could be a very simplistic explanation, saying, okay, the middle class is a typical middle class thing. India, the middle class is small, is growing, but it's still small, so no wonder that there's more freedom of expression maybe in Sweden or so, as you said. But then one thing came to my mind, and that's your argument about the environmentalism. There's the environmentalism of the middle class, and there's the environmentalism from below. So, and I'm wondering, is there perhaps something similar in India that creates a kind of a constituency for the right to freedom of expression among really the broad population, even if it is very poor, and even if many politicians are regarding it just as so much object of manipulation or something like that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. Yeah. So I think there's a sociological answer and there's a philosophical answer. What is the constituency for freedom of expression in India? All right. Now, if not all of the threats are identified are institutional, many are, but the rise of identity politics is not. All right. Now, if my argument is correct, and that despite its several salutary benefits, such as bringing remarkable figures to the foreground who were neglected, identity politics has led to threats to freedom of expression. If you add up the injured caste, communities, linguistic groups, and religion in India, who is left? Only atheists like Davolkar and Kalburgi and myself. All right. And all of you. Maybe you're not atheists, but you're here. Okay. So there could be a sociological question that maybe in India there isn't a large constituency, which is why politicians don't care about it. That could be that's a sociological answer. But there could be a deeper philosophical answer. What is the value of freedom of expression? What is the value of creative work? How do societies progress? Without Gandhi and Ambedkar debating against each other, would we have a reform of the caste system? It's to debate and dialogue and in which we can scrutinize our failures and our faults. We become more tolerant, more understanding, more equitable. That's how societies are. How do we believe in democracy? We call ourselves a democracy. Our politicians trumpet it loudest. Some years ago, when the Congress was in power, India was the lead country at Davos, the World Economic Forum in Davos. And all our banners said the world's largest democracy, apparently a slum at China. Right? So the world's okay now. So do we think we keep on? Do we believe that we should be a democracy, or should we be a benign autocracy? In which case it doesn't matter. But if it's an argument about democracy, then freedom of expression matters. If it's an argument about tolerance, pluralism, rights for disadvantaged people, then debate discussion. So the philosophical argument, even if the constituency is 5 today, or however many there are in this room today, right? Because the rest are all madly defending one icon or another. All right. Now, so this could be a sociological answer that the constituency today is limited compared to, say, Germany or to Sweden or to Canada. But it's a philosophical answer that for any society to become more tolerant, more humane, more democratic, more inclusive, more plural, X, Y, Z, you need freedom of expression. That could be right.
There's a value creation angle to it. Third one. Over a period of time, you create more value, you have more creativity, more debate.
Well, friends, unfortunately we have to stop here because we have run out of time. But thank you very much for being here in such large number. We organize in collaboration with the India International Center on the 20th September a conversation between a Pakistani art critic Salima Hashmi with the Indian cultural critic Sadanand Menon. That will be at 6:30 in the Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay Memorial Hall in India International Center on the 20th of September. Some of you may like to come and listen to that. And thank you very much, and thank you.